The Academy Awards ceremony of 1972 in Los Angeles. The Oscars.
The inscription reads, "To Charles Chaplin, for the incalculable effect he has had in making motion pictures the art form of this century."
It's been 20 years since Charlie Chaplin and his family, including my mom, Geraldine, left the United States. He spent those 20 years living in a quiet village in Switzerland, having left his Hollywood life behind. And now he was back, like he'd never been away, like nothing had ever happened. He was here for an honorary Oscar, his one and only Academy Award.
Chaplin has become more than a name. It is a word in the vocabulary of films. And anyone who has ever seen a movie is in his debt.
There was a whole new generation of stars now, and many of them had never seen him. And at the sight of Charlie Chaplin, an old man by this time, the crowd stands to applaud. It would be the longest standing ovation in the ceremony's history, lasting a full 12 minutes. My grandfather just stands there. He looks uneasy. As he waits for the cheers to subside, he touches the microphone on the podium, distorting the start of his speech.
Oh, thank you so much. This is an emotional moment for me. And words seem so futile, so feeble. Thank you for the honor of inviting me here. And, oh, you're wonderful, sweet people. Thank you.
Also on this trip, Charlie Chaplin was granted his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, more than a decade after he'd been refused one. It was as if his exile from Hollywood had been a bad dream. But in truth, this moment almost didn't happen at all. From the BBC World Service and CBC podcasts, this is Hollywood Exiles. I'm Oona Chaplin. Episode 10, Coming Back.
My childhood was just my childhood. It wasn't anything extraordinary or special or particularly different than other people have all.
This is Mitzi Trumbo. Her dad, Dalton Trumbo, was released from prison in 1951.
And yet to have attention paid to it this way is weird. It's just odd.
I can relate. I can relate.
The Trumbo family initially moved to Mexico, along with other families of writers who were now frozen out of Hollywood. But there wasn't as much work in Mexico as Dalton had hoped for, so he moved his family back to Los Angeles. Away from Hollywood's big studios, there were a number of smaller outfits, and they saw an opportunity.
He came back to find work. How was that for him?
There were producers they were the King brothers, who he worked for a lot. It was all under different names. It was all very secret.
The King brothers made cheap, simple movies, gangster movies, monster movies, westerns, films like The Dude Goes West, directed by Kurt Newman.
You think an honest man could shoot the way he does? You're lying. You're lying. Come on, let's get him on.
They needed scripts, lots of scripts. And frankly, they didn't care who wrote them. So as long as Dalton Trumbo didn't use his real name, they were more than happy to have a writer of his caliber on their roster.
He was working all the time under different names. He would sometimes write a script every week or two. It was incredible. He'd be starting work at 6 in the morning, he'd come up at 6 p.m. for dinner and then go back to work. He was driven. He was completely driven. And it was all about figuring out how to earn a living, how to help other people, all the friends, and find jobs for them as well if he could be helpful, and to just try to destroy the blacklist as best he could. It was his obsession, I would say.
Trumbo helped other writers too. He became the go-between for them and the King Brothers studio. Mitzi's home became a script factory, but she couldn't tell anybody.
My parents really believed that we kids should know everything that was going on. So I didn't really understand. I was a little too young to understand the political aspects of it, but I did know that I couldn't talk about anything my father was doing. And I knew that nobody knew his name really.
There were always people calling Dalton Trumbo, asking him for scripts, but they couldn't ask for Dalton Trumbo.
If the phone rang and somebody would ask for somebody like Sam Jackson or Joe Bonham or whatever, I'd just say, "Here, Daddy, this is for you." Because there were no wrong numbers, is what I'm trying to say. Right. You never knew who was going to be calling. So.
And did you carry your name, Trumbo, in school and things like that?
Yes.
How was school being back here for you, with your father being who he was?
Well, the name did have an impact. You didn't know how people were going to react. I had a bad experience in 5th grade. I had made some friends at our little local elementary, but somehow it came out that there were these communists in the neighborhood, and there were secret meetings at the school, and my mother was getting ostracized from participating. And then the kids started being really kind of awful to me, so it was a tough time.
For the children of the exiled artists, whether they were in Hollywood or elsewhere, these were difficult times, as they were for the family of Will Geer.
Oh gosh, of course.
Oh boy. Hello, I'm Oona. I'm Geraldine's daughter.
Wonderful to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
I'm in Topanga, not all that far from Hollywood, a place called the Theatricum Botanicum. I was actually living really close to here during the COVID-19 lockdown, and the place was always closed, so it was a real pleasure to visit now. The custodian these days is Ellen Geer, the eldest daughter of Will Geer, an actor in Hollywood during the 30s and 40s.
I know, Theater of Plans.
Yes, exactly.
And Papa went to college at the University of Chicago, and he got a degree in horticulture.
Oh.
So what he always said about himself, I'm an actor and I'm a horticulturist, yeah.
There's a beautiful outdoor auditorium here, surrounded by the Geer family's garden. The plants are inspired by Shakespeare's plays. It's a home and refuge to the Geer family.
So those were the two ways he made his living. And so when the blacklist came, this is where my mother found this place. It was only $10,000. And we moved up here one stormy, cold night. And I'll take you, if you'd like to see the place where we landed.
Like Mitzi, Ellen's father was summoned to the House Un-American Activities Committee, after which he couldn't find work. For Ellen, it's difficult to look back. It's difficult to confront what happened.
I have found I always step back, and do everything through my art, whether it's writing or singing or whatever we're doing. The actual politics stuff, I think it hurt too bad our family to jump in again. I mean, I'll still go to a rally and sing a song, but to really be involved deeply in it, my father protected us from that, and I protect my children from it. I'm sorry you never got to meet Pop, and some of my children haven't met him, but he was an extraordinary human being. Yeah. He was like a tree, He loved everything. He loved trees, people, and it was with absolute open honesty.
That's so good.
Yeah, good man. It wasn't like your grandfather. There was eliteness in Hollywood, do you know? Mm-hmm. Papa was
There still is.
and Pop was always, you know, he did the supporting roles. He always would go onto a set, you know, and there was manure on his boots from doing his gardening and what have you. He was always that way, so that he was never elite in Hollywood at all.
As much as Ellen felt protected by her family, she wasn't unaware of what was going on in the outside world.
The politics was not something they didn't want to, I don't think they wanted to bring that kind of ugliness in our life.
Burl Ives, a musician and actor who was a friend of the Geer family, was one of the many artists to be called before HUAC. He was one of the artists to name names. The passion, the sadness with which Ellen still speaks his name is palpable.
I mean, Burl Ives, my mother taught him the guitar. We called him Uncle Burl, and he ratted. So there was that separation.
Fearful of losing his own livelihood, Burl agreed to testify in 1952. Friendships and family bonds were being torn apart. This was a very personal struggle. Two Hollywoods had emerged. One controlled by a handful of powerful studios, the 5 major studios who made the big movies, the big money, and didn't want anything to do with artists tainted with any hint of communism. And the other Hollywood, where writers like Dalton Trumbo worked in secret, cheap movies, and a lot of them. But both Hollywoods were telling the same stories. The studios were more risk-averse than ever. They wouldn't want to be accused of putting anything subversive on the screen.
Many of the movies of the 1950s, to our mind, would tend to seem very conservative and very consensus in terms of their notion of American culture.
Thomas Doherty is the author of Show Trial, Hollywood, HUAC, and the Birth of the Blacklist.
You know, if you look at the movies of this age, particularly after the blacklist really starts taking effect, you don't see nearly as much overt polemics in Hollywood cinema. You don't see any criticism of the American way of doing things.
Hollywood movies played a big part in American culture in the 1940s and 50s. Alongside newspapers, the content of movies were the dominant expression of Americanism. But what was and was not American was being determined by the major studios.
I think what it does is contribute to the kind of conservative mentality of the 1950s.
For anybody who didn't fit within that conservative mentality, for anybody who thought differently or wanted to change the system, they were now outsiders, and the prevailing dominant culture told them it was so. Now, you could be forgiven for not feeling a part of that America. You could be given the impression that you weren't welcome in that America. When I asked my mom, Geraldine Chaplin, about my grandfather's return to the United States, she told me that the Oscars ceremony wasn't the first time that he'd returned.
We had landed in Alaska on our way to Japan for some holiday, and my father refused to get off the plane.
Changing planes in Anchorage on the way to a holiday in Tokyo from Europe, Charlie Chaplin had stayed stubbornly in his seat.
He found out Alaska was the United States, and he said, "I'm not getting off this plane." They said, "Well, Mr. Chaplin, you have to get off the plane." And he said, "I'm not getting off." And then he finally did get off. He said, "Oh, wow, yeah, a good American cup of coffee."
On that occasion, he wouldn't leave the airport terminal and didn't officially set foot again on U.S. soil before his return in 1972. But that trip wasn't without drama. On the 5th of March, 1971, the U.S. ambassador to Switzerland telegraphs the Attorney General and the Secretary of State to let them know that Charlie Chaplin has been invited to an event in his honor in the United States. The ambassador recommends, I quote, swift waiving of Chaplin's ineligibility to avoid unfavorable publicity for the U.S. He wants the United States to let my grandfather back into the country because denying him, well, that would look bad. The following January, the case is brought to the desk of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover himself. There's a letter in the file addressed directly to Hoover. It reads, in part, I've read Charlie Chaplin is to return to the United States to receive some type of award. This communist bastard turned his back on this land of ours and took millions of dollars out of this country. As a red-blooded American, I want you to make every effort to keep this son of a bitch out of our country. Whoever wrote that letter remains classified. The names are blacked out. Hoover is 77 years old at this point. He's been FBI director for 4 decades. But even after all these years, the name Charlie Chaplin is enough to warrant a response from Hoover within days. He draws the attention of the INS to Chaplin's visa application. He writes, since your comments may be of interest to the Commissioner, Immigration and Naturalization Service, I am referring copies of your communication and my reply to him. There is no explicit instruction from Hoover contained in the file, but his letter seems to have had an effect.
Do you remember him going back to the United States after all those years?
Yes.
For the Oscars?
Yes, he went back for the Oscars, and he was so thrilled because my mother, who had given up her American nationality in 1954, and ours, she was allowed a visa for multiple entries.
Yeah.
Yes, however many entries. I mean, I don't think they last 3 years or something like that. And my father was allowed 5 days, I think, or 7 days. And he was so thrilled. He said, they're still scared of me. They're still scared of me.
It would be J. Edgar Hoover's final intervention in my grandfather's life, after first starting a file on him half a century before in 1922. 3 weeks after the Oscars ceremony, Hoover had a heart attack and died in his home in Washington, D.C. Suspicions about those who'd been communist members or associates of communists remained high even into the 1970s, which speaks to how enormous the cultural divisions were. Ellen Geer.
In the long run, this kind of behavior it's not natural. It's not right.
What kind of behavior?
Separating people, making a black and white society. This is right, this is wrong. That disturbs me. And that's what HUAC did.
Yeah.
It separated people, ostracized some wonderful artists. It did a lot of destruction in our family.
When Will Geer had gone before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1952, he'd been a successful actor, and he came away as somebody who wasn't able to get a job. I asked Ellen about what that did to him and what that did to their family.
When you take away a person's passion, and that's what happened with HUAC, Papa was really, there was a childness, there was childlike about him. And he would plant around, but he suddenly became all shaggy, and his body was bending over, and you know, when he first came back from HUAC, he ran for office.
Will Geer's first instinct seems to have been to fight. Ellen tells me that straight after HUAC, he ran for public office. But an incident at a rally made him think again.
And we were all up there holding the signs about how he would change things. And we were little kids down in LA. And I remember an old lady who came out, and she was bright red in the face, and you commie, you you get this, you're teaching these kids these kinds of things, you know. It was really terrible. And that's when I saw Pop begin to shrink, because he looked at us, he saw what this woman was saying, and then we kind of hid up here. And then the family split up. It split our family up, yeah. It's difficult. Yeah. It's difficult for me. See, just pops up. And it's hard to watch your family fall apart. It breaks your heart. Pop was like, take a big heart, take a big, beautiful heart, and you have Pop holding the heart together like that. And then along comes Uncle Sam and goes bang, bang, bang. And then it all shatters. It's all gone. And it's not there anymore. So you find you spend your life trying to resurrect that, because it was very, very good.
There was such heartbreak for so many families, and that heartbreak continues to resonate to this day. They don't get to leave these events far behind them. Amidst the trauma in the 1950s, Dalton Trumbo kept his head down. He was fighting back. He was writing movie after movie under all kinds of different aliases. His kids still went to school, not telling anybody who their dad was or what he did for a living.
When he wrote a script called The Brave One, which came out in 1957, a sweet little film about a boy and a bull, that was the year that everything really changed.
Set in 1950s Mexico, the young boy, Leonardo, creates a friendship with a bull, later trying to save it from a fight with the champion matador.
The King brothers, who had hired my father for many things, as well as other blacklisted writers, were the producers, and the name they used on it was Robert Rich. And so Robert Rich was nominated for Best Original Story for an Oscar.
Back then, there were a number of different Oscars for writing, and screenplays and stories were each given their own category.
I am delighted to be able to present the Writing Awards. The nominations for Best Motion Picture Story are Robert Rich for The Brave One,
March 1957, the 29th Academy Awards.
The envelope, please. The Brave One, Robert Rich.
And amazingly, it won. I remember watching it with the family. We were all watching on TV, and my first reaction was, Daddy, let's go get it tomorrow. And I had to kind of be reminded that this wasn't something that we could do. You know, that wasn't going to happen.
Yes, Vice President of the Screenwriters Branch of the Writers Guild will accept the award for Mr. Rich.
On behalf of Robert Rich and his beautiful story, thank you very much.
Congratulations.
Speculation about who Robert Rich was went into overdrive. But the truth was that everybody in Hollywood knew Robert Rich was Dalton Trumbo. In interviews and public appearances, he was pressed on it. And Trumbo would never deny it, but he wouldn't confirm it either.
Sir, are you the missing author, Robert Rich?
Well, I am Dalton Trumbo. I am compelled to say that I will neither confirm that I wrote this picture, nor deny.
Well, would you like to encourage it here, as you have done?
Encourage what?
The report that you might have been Robert Rich?
I might, yes. Oh, encourage the report or encourage the speculation?
Encourage both.
I would encourage the speculation.
All right.
The report was not of my making.
Then, Mr. Trumbo, are you having a secret cloak and dagger game about this?
I haven't seen a cloak or a dagger since I was blacklisted.
Trumbo speaking on television program Night Beat in 1957. The remarkable thing is that this wasn't the first Oscar Trumbo's work had won. He'd also written Roman Holiday 4 years earlier. And other mysterious names, pseudonyms for other writers, also won Oscars through the 50s. It was making the whole system look redundant.
Which made it look exactly like my father wanted it to look, which was ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know.
The day would come when Dalton Trumbo could collect that Oscar. Whilst Dalton Trumbo was working hard fighting the blacklist and Will Geer had retreated to his sanctuary in the hills, my grandfather was far across the water in Europe. One thing the people I spoke to kept saying was that it was different for him, different than for anybody else. Was there a sense that he should have stayed, should have fought? Ellen Geer.
I do have one question, and it's sensitive, and I'm also really happy for you to brush it off, because I really only want you to express what you feel really good about expressing. A few people have mentioned, the different experience that my grandfather would have had. And I wondered if you felt that there was an injustice in staying, or like if there was a part of the outlook on my grandfather that might have been cowardly.
Oh, God, no.
No?
No. Anybody, in order to get through that period of suppression, anything that you did to keep your heart and your spirit and your family together was what was important. Extremely important.
My grandfather's story is different from other artists that were affected, like Will Geer. Chaplin was a big star, for one thing. He'd made a lot of money by this point in his career. He was in his 50s, and he could afford to take a back seat. He was sort of lucky in that sense. And others really weren't. The big studios in Hollywood were powerful, so powerful they could pick and choose who to work with and be very selective in how much or how little those artists got paid. Those artists had very little to fall back on. And on top of that, they were shut out of the communities that they'd called home, told that they didn't belong there anymore. They'd failed some test of Americanism. There was no coming back from that. So, how did this end? When were artists allowed back into Hollywood, regardless of their politics or background? Well, that's a complicated question. A breakthrough came in 1960. Dalton Trumbo was working on 2 movies, one called Spartacus and another Exodus.
When my father was working on Spartacus, it was pretty much an open secret in Hollywood. Everybody knew.
Spartacus was set to be a blockbuster, starring Kirk Douglas and directed by Stanley Kubrick. Exodus was a historical drama on the founding of the State of Israel. It was directed by Otto Preminger, who in 1960 did something extraordinary.
January 1960, my father got a phone call from Otto Preminger, and all he said was, "Dalton, look at the front page of the New York Times today," and hung up. And so he did, and Preminger had announced, and it was on the front page, that Dalton Trumbo's name was going to be on Exodus. And it was just like, whoa, there you go, it's happened.
Years of lies, mystery, and sneaking around were over. Dalton Trumbo's name, his very own name, would appear on a movie credit for the first time in more than a decade. The other movie, Spartacus, would soon follow suit. Dalton Trumbo was back in business.
My father bought a dozen tickets to each film's matinee so that I could take all my friends. So finally, it was like, whoa, hey. I remember so much fun.
And what did they say? What did your friends say?
Probably, I don't know. I don't remember that. What I do remember is my father dropping us off, my father in one car and my mother in another. And I remember my father walking down the street I just remember watching him. It's kind of lovely. Here, make me cry. When finally he had his name on the screen, it was like, okay.
And looking back on that moment, do you think that he broke the blacklist? Did it feel like that?
You know, the blacklist was never broken, simply because so many people were affected and never got their jobs back and never had careers again. It was broken for him, for sure, but it was just a pinprick in the whole picture of it for so many people. Most people did not get their jobs back, their careers back, their lives back. It was a very destructive time for families, for marriages, for all that.
Dalton Trumbo worked to the bone through the 50s to get the recognition and the career that he deserved. Many, many others were not so lucky. They'd lost their best years, their most productive and creative years, to the exile they'd been forced into. The vast majority never got a second chance. Will Geer, Ellen's dad, was also among the lucky ones. On stage at the Theatricum Botanicum, she tells me about the role for which he will forever be best remembered by a generation of Americans.
When we were grown and we all started to have our own families, and we decided to build this, and Pop had money then, because after 10 years of being blacklisted, being a bad guy, he suddenly became Apple Pie of America, and that was Grandpa Walton on the Waltons, which is a family show.
Good night, Jim Bob.
Good night, Jim Bob.
What's going on? I was asleep. What's everybody doing?
Good night,
Good night, Jim Bob.
Whether they were able to recover their careers in some way or not, what happened to this generation of people that were branded un-American would stay with them and their families for the rest of their lives.
Do you think he was bitter about what happened to him?
I think that he so often said, of course I'm not bitter about America, that he must have been very bitter.
My mom, Geraldine Chaplin.
He was always saying, I'm not bitter, I'm not bitter. Of course I'm not bitter. He did say it very often, so I gather he was bitter.
In episode 1, I said I would try to be objective in telling this story. Of course, as Charlie Chaplin's granddaughter, this is deeply personal. I am grateful that things unfolded in the way they did. I may never have been born if they hadn't. But it must have been very hard for my grandfather and our family to be so misrepresented and misunderstood, to be outcast for the values that they upheld in their life and strong-armed out of their home. The people that I've had the honor to meet on this journey have deep scars from that time. The culture of naming and shaming cast adrift families like the Trumbos, the Geers, and so many others. They had to face the insidiousness of ideological warfare, and these wounds are not easy to heal. The tension between the left and the right, between communism and capitalism, generated a climate of fear and intolerance. But the thing that troubles me the most is that those who seized control over what stories made their way to the public painted such a narrow picture of America, and in so doing totally undermined the freedom and democracy that they claimed to defend. Those who had the power to define what was American labeled anything that threatened that idea communist, and therefore dangerous and evil. So it became nearly impossible for people to share ideas freely, to represent themselves truthfully, and express the contents of their hearts. And what was political became personal. People, neighbors, friends followed the lead of political figures, pointed fingers, named names, cast out. But why do we do this? Why do we try to shut down the people that we disagree with? Why do those in power so often want to control the narrative and destroy the opposition? Truth is not afraid of conversation. Rather, it welcomes it. What I've learned here has strengthened my own ability to hear the human beings that seem to sit across the aisle. And for every conversation, I give thanks. Hollywood Exiles is a production of BBC Audio Wales for the BBC World Service and CBC Podcasts. I'm Oona Chaplin. Oscar ceremony highlights from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences for the 29th Academy Awards, 1957, and the 44th Academy Awards, 1972. We'd like to thank all the families who shared their experiences and stories with us. Special thanks, too, to historian and author Ed Rempel. For Audio Archive, thanks to the Wisconsin Center for Film and Theater Research and the UCLA Department of Communication Archive. Our producers are Glyn Tansley and Megan Jones. Research by Alice McKee and Dan Potts. Archive research by Fendel Fulton and Emily Preston. Music by Phil Channel and sound design by Kathy Robinson and Phil Channel. Our theme is by Nick Thorburn. Executive producer for BBC Audio is Martin Smith. At the BBC World Service, Prabjit Bains is senior producer and John Manel is the podcast commissioning editor. At CBC Podcasts, Jeff Turner is senior producer. The coordinating producer is Anna Ashite. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is senior manager. Arif Noorani is the director, and Leslie Merklinger is executive director of CBC Podcasts. Thank you for listening.